So good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Isabelle Chopin. I'm MPG's director, and I will be moderating this webinar, trying to be as strict as possible with the timing because we want to allow for discussion and questions at the end. So I'm really thrilled to see so many of you attending our webinar, presenting MPG's policy brief on racial structural discrimination and migrant voice. The policy brief has been published earlier today, so you can find it on our webpage. And the webinar will be recorded and published later today. So this webinar is part of MPG's project called the New Europeans Initiative, supported by the SURF program of the EU. And it really aligns with the work that MPG has been doing for the past decades on fighting racial discrimination and promoting political participation. The most recent projects we have been working in this area are, for example, the Vote Europa campaign, aiming at promoting political participation from first-time voters, new Europeans, such as mobile EU citizens and migrants, to the European elections. And how did we do that? We did that by training trainers from the different communities on the national level who have been in return training and informing citizens. And if I remember well, Adele was one of our trainers. We also had the All Europa campaign that promoted the European election by doing and sharing videos on young new Europeans on the European subject of interest, showing the link between the EU and the citizens. We also added a new component in the update of the MyPEX on political participation that was launched for the 27 EU member states a few months ago. And as most of you probably know, within our work on anti-discrimination, we also already worked on structural racism and launched in the fall 24 our policy recommendations to that extent. So let's ask ourselves the following questions. Who gets heard in European democracies? And if some are not heard and left behind in the participatory process, how to overcome the obstacle? So we will first hear from MPG's senior legal policy analyst Carmine Conte and our former research trainee Anoushka Gautam, how to better build inclusive democracies. They will present the policy brief and the related research that is being launched today. Then we will hear reactions from our 4 panelists, and there will be time for questions, which participants will be able to raise by clicking on the raise hand button that you can find at the bottom of your screen, or to write your questions in the Q&A section. But before I head on to Carmine and Anoushka, some logistics. The webinar is being recorded, but only the speakers' faces and names will appear in the recorded event. So if you want to raise a question, but you don't want to be identified, then I would advise to write it in the Q&A chat box that is at the bottom and not to raise your hand. And as said before, the webinar will be available at the end of the day on the MPG's webpage. But without losing any further time, I'm now giving the word to Carmine and Anoushka for the presentation of the policy brief.
Thanks, Isabelle. As you anticipated, we will present our policy brief. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will share with Anoushka. And I hope you can all see the PowerPoint that present our policy brief on racial structural discrimination and migrant voice who gets heard in European democracy. We are asking this question because we think that this is an important, fundamental question for our European society and democracy. And especially considering that racial structural discrimination is not only about individual bias, but it's about systemic barriers that shape access to political participation and representation of racialized community. And if we have a problem about this right now, this represents both a diversity integration problem, but also a democratic one. So I'm really pleased to be with you today with such a dream team to unpack these questions with evidence, research, and also concrete proposal to tackle structural racism. So in today's presentation, just to give a brief overview, we will talk about our policy brief, our contribution to the general research and policy discussion on the topic. And we will do so by taking into account the research that ABG has been done on political participation through the Political Participation Policy Index that you can find on our website. And we will really dive into 5 main dimensions of political participation. The first one is citizenship. The second one is the right to vote in election. The third one is the encouragement to vote. And then we will talk about representation of racialized community in political life and representation of civil society. And I will conclude this very short presentation by presenting some key policy recommendation to tackle sexual racism and also to foster political participation of racialized groups. So let's get started. And yeah, our theory is basically to demonstrate that sexual racism, as I said, is not just about individual discrimination, but it's really embedded in our institutions, law, and political system. And we would like to reframe the issues of political participation as also an outcome of power relation and institutional designs relations, rather than just an individual motivation or integration deficit. And I would like to advance an understanding of political participation that is a multidimensional process that extend beyond just voting rights or the formal rights to vote, but also include the representation, influencing decision-making process. And we like to do so by bridging research on racialization, migration, and also democracy. Our policy impact that we would like to achieve is to show that more political participation frameworks, policy frameworks, are associated also with a stronger democratic engagement and legitimacy. And as I mentioned before, formal rights are not sufficient alone when sexual bias, discrimination practice exist. So we need to combine rights with also active outreach, anti-discrimination measures, civic education, and also support for racialized-led and migrant-led civil society organization. So we will talk about this through the lens also of the Political Participation Index. That is a comparative tool that has been developed by MPG to assess different national policy and models of political participation across the EU. It does so by looking at 8 key dimensions and 29 indicators that are applied in all the member states. And however, for our analysis, we will only focus on 5 main dimensions that we think are more relevant as well, that most relevant for also racialized community and migrants. So we'll look at citizenship, as I said, the right to vote, encouragement to vote, and also to the representation of migrants in political life and a representation of civil society. Before looking at the results, I would like just to highlight what's the legal framework, the legal policy framework on the topic. And we can say that despite the evidence of inequality and discrimination, still the debate on institutional and structural racism is absent at a political level. And there's still not a comprehensive definition of structural racism under European law. However, we have to also welcome the new developments that have been done in the anti-racist strategy because the Commission is proposing to facilitate development by member states of a working definition of structural racism. And for sure, we can talk more about this later on with our speakers. However, the Commission plan on integration still doesn't emphasize the dimension of political participation as one of the key pathways of integration. So this is something that still has to be, let's say, addressed by the policy makers, as we consider as a key dimension of integration. But now I would like to pass the words to my colleague, Anoushka, that will start to talk about what is political participation and also the main findings of our research.
Thank you, Carmine. So why does participation matter? Political participation is both a driver of integration, as it strengthens the sense of belonging, and a precondition for an effective and representative democracy. Meaningful participation therefore requires that there are equal opportunities for migrants and racialized groups to have their voices taken seriously and reflected in decision-making processes. Yet persistent participation gaps remain. When migrants are absent from decision-making spaces, it reflects a democratic deficit, incomplete integration, and signals enduring structural barriers. So what is structural discrimination? It actually operates through three interlinked components. Historical discrimination, which involves the legacies of the past. When there's a lack of recognition of, for example, slavery and colonialism and their ongoing impact, their effect continues to shape present-day inequalities. Societal discrimination, which operates through the dominant norms that reinforce the belonging and recognition of white nationals over racialized people, and institutional discrimination, which involves the policies and practices that of institutions that undermine the rights and opportunities of racialized groups. Together, these dimensions reinforce one another and produce persistent inequalities, which we can refer to as structural discrimination. So, we will now present our findings on how the different dimensions of the political participation of racialized groups continue to be shaped by persistent forms of discrimination. First, we discuss citizenship policies, which represent the main pathways to acquisition of full political and civic rights. Naturalization in the EU is often portrayed as accessible. However, sometimes this is far from the case. Many people who were born and raised in the EU still continue to be denied citizenship. So there remains a disconnect between belonging and recognition. This is largely due to exclusionary citizenship criteria. This includes, for example, high language requirements, costly fees, integration exams, which all tend to disproportionately exclude racialized and socioeconomically marginalized groups. Research has actually found that the average naturalization fee has more than doubled since 2000. Other research has focused on discriminatory practices that are embedded in naturalization procedures. For example, Denmark introduced a mandatory handshake requirement at citizenship ceremonies. While some have framed this as a symbol of integration, other lawmakers have argued that this is a targeted policy aimed at Muslims. Thus, it functions as a cultural conformity test rather than an inclusion measure. So, now, basically, this slide shows how the score derived from the political participation index, which shows 46 out of 100, it just demonstrates significant disparities across Europe regarding citizenship policies. Voting rights are also a key way in which democracies recognize racialized communities as equal members of society and enable their participation. While exclusion from the ballot box does not by itself constitute discrimination, it becomes structural when systematic barriers persistently prevent these groups from accessing voting rights. When voting rights is, for example, strictly tied to citizenship, and naturalization procedures have remained systematically difficult to access or selectively restrictive, it constitutes structural and persistent barriers for migrants accessing voting. Furthermore, across the EU, access to voting remains fragmented. National elections are almost exclusively reserved for citizens, while on a regional and local scale, EU mobile citizens have the right to vote under EU law. However, third country nationals experience systemic exclusion from electoral participation, with a few cases being the exception. Third, even when rights exist, restrictive conditions further limit participation. For example, Spain tends to grant local voting rights to only certain third country nationals whose country of origin already has a reciprocity agreement with Spain. This includes countries such as Colombia, Korea, and Bolivia, but may arbitrarily restrict and exclude many other long-term residents. Other restrictive requirements also may include residency thresholds and things. So again, the political participation index, showing a score of 32 in the key dimension of electoral voting, reflects that there are persistent barriers for both third country nationals and EU mobile citizens in accessing their voting rights. So this slide discusses the dimension of encouragement to vote, which is member states' effort to promote electoral participation amongst racialized groups. Evidence suggests that even when they are formally eligible to vote, they tend to participate in elections at much lower rates than native-born populations. Part of this may be due to group-specific factors such as age, income, level of political socialization. However, they are reinforced by structural barriers, such as lack of accessible and targeted information. Institutional support also varies widely, with few member states taking proactive measures such as automatic registration, targeted voter information to actually mobilize racialized groups. Research also demonstrates that experiencing discrimination has a complex impact on racialized groups. For example, facing discrimination can lead to political disillusionment in many, but when experienced collectively as a group, it can actually trigger further mobilization and increase non-electoral participation, such as protests. And in the last slide, not the last slide, but the next slide, we basically show how the political participation index show the score of only 17, one of the lowest of all the indexes, reflecting that there's a widespread lack of measures and sometimes resistance to facilitate democratic engagement. I'm going to pass it on to Carmine, who will finish off the findings and talk about the policy recommendations. Thank you.
Anoushka. Indeed, another dimension is the representation of racialized group and migrants in political life. And as we all know, I think there is a representation gap. Migrants, but also European citizens with a racial ethnic background remain unrepresented in elected office, reflecting the structural barriers in party system, electoral rules, access to information. I think that according to the in the new parliament, only 37, if I remember well, of MEPs have racial ethnic background, so very little if we consider how diverse our society is. And this is also due to, for instance, structural discrimination barriers that we have found, analyzed. For instance, when it comes to the right to stand for election, we found that there are many restrictions at the national level, and this exclusion becomes structural discriminatory when combined also with the naturalization regimes that are always very restricted, as Anoushka explained before. But not only, we have also found institutional informal practices within the political party system. For instance, there is limited access to campaign resources, there is limited access to leadership position for certain minority group. For instance, we have people with the ethnic background but that run for election, but they are placed in a position that is very difficult for them to get elected. And in some member states, for instance, in Poland, there is even the membership to a party is limited to national. So this is also, of course, creates barriers for other groups to participate. However, research shows that more diverse political participation correlates also with higher turnout among migrants and racialized group. So this is something that it's really should be better promoted at national level. And you can see, as you can see in our political participation index, there is an average score only 51 point on this dimension, highlighting disparities across member states, with only 3 countries like Luxembourg, Finland, and Ireland that are really having more progressive, let's say, policies in this area. The last dimension that we would like to look at is the representation of racialized minorities and migrant civil society organization, because we know that consultative bodies are key channel for organizing collective interest, especially for migrants and racialized group. But we know that at the national level they have weak mandates, meaning that frequently these bodies are just symbolic, do not really represent the different groups, have limited power to influence the decision-making process. And we have also found unequal practice, meaning that only 15 member states have binding stakeholders participation policies, and only 6 member states have diversity-sensitive consultation guidelines. And also other report, for instance, for FRA, show that racialized and migrants CSO face exclusion from consultation, funding constraints. Also, there are also some hostility for being too critical sometimes towards policy making. And this is also reflected, these findings, in our policy index, where there are several disparities again when it comes to policies for the participation of civil society organizations. But now I would like just to move quickly to the policy recommendation and to end our analysis and then listen from our speakers. So we would really suggest recommend to recognize first the structural aspect of the discrimination as also a barrier to political participation by adopting a legal provision of sexual discrimination and also effective sanction for in the framework of equality and discrimination laws. Another important step is to foster inclusive citizenship, ensure affordable, accessible procedures, and also adopt proactive measures to facilitate access to citizenship for long-term residents. Then another important formal right is the one to have access to vote and candidacy rights. So it's important to guarantee local and regional voting and candidate rights to third country national based on residency, also allowing rights for European mobile citizens. Then we also recommend to promote inclusive political messaging that research show that has a good impact on the turnout of migrants in the political participation, and also to have more diverse recruitment and more transparent candidate selection. Also, it's important to dismantle administrative barriers to political participation by simplifying voting registration, introducing automatic registration, and provide clear information for voters. And also adopt targeted campaigns to inform racialized groups, migrants about electoral system, voting procedures, and also participation option as part of anti-racism and integration policies. And also, it's important to also institutionalize the role of racialized groups, civil society organization into the policy making, and ensure the meaningful consultation in the policy making process with recognized authority, decision-making power, and also with a clear mandate to issue independent recommendation. So I know I took a bit of 2 minutes longer, but I really invite you to also look at our policy brief on our website that's been published today. And of course, later on, if there is any question, we will be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carmine and Anoushka, for this very comprehensive, meaningful, and very full contribution to the issue of structural racism and political participation. There was already a question in the Q&A, and Carmine, maybe you can just say a few words about that. We were asked about who do we intend, or the definition of migrants for that policy brief. If you could just say a few words, and then I will hand it over to the panel.
Yeah, actually, we have a broad, thanks for the question. We have a broad scope because the index per se looks at as target group third country nationals, but also actually European mobile citizens, for instance, and also other group of migrants like refugee, asylum seekers. But also in our analysis, we don't look only at migrants, but also racialized community groups that are racialized for different reasons, that are European citizens in most cases, but have an ethnic background, and so therefore are racialized, meaning that are discriminated for being part of a certain community. And despite being European citizens, sometimes they even have more obstacles and barriers to actually access the political debate.
Thank you. So I will now hand over to our panel, and I'm really, really happy to have the four of you, Michaela, Julie, Yunjun, and Adele, with us today. We've been collaborating with the four of you in different forms or different projects for some time. So thank you very much for accepting to participate, and I'm looking forward to hear your reactions. So we are starting with Michaela. Michaela Moua is the EU First Anti-Racism Coordinator, and she still has quite a task ahead of her. She was at the forefront of the drafting of the latest EU Anti-Racism Strategy 2630 that has just been presented last month, among the many things that she's doing. She has extensive experience in non-discrimination issue, and she's worked notably when back in Finland for the Finnish non-discrimination ombudsman. So Michaela, the word is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Isabelle, and thank you, Carmine and Anoushka, for this great presentation, and for MPG in general for this very important policy brief. I think already from the presentation, we can really see that and hear that racialized and migrant communities remain, unfortunately, largely invisible in political institutions. We know that people of African descent, Roma, Muslims and Jews and Asians, also other racialized groups who make up to an estimated 10% of the EU population, are not adequately represented. And as mentioned by Carmine, 37 of the current 720 MEPs, only 37 of the current 720 MEPs in the European Parliament come from diverse backgrounds, and we only now in this new mandate of the Commission have our first racialized commissioner. So these numbers are only part of the story. We're talking really still about people who contribute, pay taxes, contribute to societies, raise families, but at the same time they do not have a meaningful voice in decisions that are made that are impacting their lives. So this is really structural discrimination, as was very well also described by Anoushka. Secondly, I think this policy brief comes really at a critical moment. We're really witnessing currently democratic backsliding, including the erosion of institutions, norms, and practices related to democratic participation. And I want to just share a few of the approaches of the Commission to respond to these concerns, namely the anti-racism strategy, which was mentioned by Isabelle. We recently adopted only on January 20th, but also the Democracy Shield and the Civil Society strategy. And all of these strategies of the Commission address different dimensions of the problem. I'll try to keep my intervention short so that we have enough time indeed for the Q&A. So the anti-racism strategy really places, which will span from 2026 to 2030 and is a continuation to the anti-racism action plan, really centers structural discrimination at its core, looking at it from the aspect of accumulated barriers that people face over a lifetime in key areas that deny equal opportunities and can be, of course, across generations. But also, of course, links to the lack of understanding of historical atrocities as well, as also mentioned by Anoushka. On political participation specifically, inclusive democracies are crucial in ensuring social cohesion, and how, from the perspective of the strategy, we look at structural discrimination impacting exclusion from political participation, meaning that when people can't vote, their concerns really disappear. And of course, politicians then do not even campaign for the votes, and the issues then for vulnerable or marginalized communities, including migrants and other racialized communities, become invisible. Another matter is the underrepresentation in political institutions. So when legislators don't reflect the populations they serve. For instance, legislation is passed without understanding the impact of entire communities. And so this structural discrimination really creates these different multiple barriers. And also something that was mentioned was, of course, the marginalization of civil society. So when civil society is marginalized, it's a loss. First of all, it's a sign of weakening democracies, but also expertise is lost and policies are designed without the input of those impacted. And lastly, of course, the erosion of trust in democratic institutions. Secondly, I'd like to mention the Democracy Shield, which was adopted last year. And this provides, I would say, a framework for strengthening democratic resilience overall. And I'd just like to mention 3 of its priorities. One is safeguarding information integrity. So this Democracy Shield establishes, for instance, a European Center for Democratic Resilience, which brings together member states and EU institutions to detect foreign information manipulation, but also the stakeholder platform, which will ensure that civil society, this includes migrant-led and racialized organizations, can feed into its work. Secondly, the Democracy Shield also aims to strengthen electoral processes. The regulation on political advertising bans, for instance, ads from third country sponsors 3 months before the elections, as well as the DSA elections toolkit. And thirdly, the recommendation on safety in politics. And this is addressing specific threats faced by candidates from minority backgrounds, and particularly women. We know that they face a disproportionate harassment, specifically online. So this is of course something that can then prevent people from placing themselves as candidates, and drives, out of fear, can drive marginalized persons out of politics due to fear of these threats. And then lastly, it promotes the citizenship, education, and media literacy. And then, of course, the last tool I'd like to mention is the EU strategy for civil society, which was also adopted last year, establishing 10 different guiding principles. I won't go into all of these, but many of them were mentioned already in the presentation on the policy brief, including transparency, including representation, inclusivity, accessibility, as well as resourcing and safety. And one of the main elements will be to create a civil society platform, which also will ensure, the aim is to ensure that the diversity of the organizations part of the platform are indeed as diverse as possible, including migrant organizations and organizations advocating for racialized people and communities. And lastly, it recognizes the importance of funding for civil society organizations. And here the Commission has proposed to increase the funding through the SERVE program to 3.6 billion in the next MFF. And this means it would be doubled from the previous amount of funding. So just to come to an end of my presentation, we have to recognize that the consequences for a lack of democratic participation for racialized and migrant communities is, of course, self-evident, and I really thank you for this very important policy brief, and especially the recommendations will be very helpful also for myself and the work we're doing to ensure inclusive democracies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Thank you. And indeed, let's keep in mind the effect and the consequences of underrepresentation on the decisions that are being made, and not only the erosion of institutional trust, as you said. And thanks also for mentioning the funding and giving a bit of indication, because that's something that a lot of us civil society organizations are struggling with right now. But our next panelist is Yunjun. Yunjun Lee is a lead researcher and secretary at Asian Voices Europe, and she works to counter anti-Asian racism discourse through data-driven policy advocacy. In our latest project on structural racism, one of the research findings was that the Asian community has been the silent community for too long. So I'm very glad to have your views on the issue, Yunjun.
Thank you for MPG for this wonderful policy brief and also this webinar. As this policy brief mentions that Europe has been continued to have very extremely low rates of the racialized and marginalized voices in both political engagements and also participation, due to many of the reasons that our Carmine and Anoushka mentions really nicely. And when migrants and racialized communities are underrepresented in institutions and policy, then of course, naturally, these policies are shaped against us, and then applied to us. So this vicious cycle always ends up in a post-migration policy. In the end, ends up in the landscape where this dominant narrative that diverted from us and them, like migrants as othered people, this mentality always pursue the slogan like "our people first," and this "our people first," of course, wouldn't reflect the reality, and then, of course, oppress the underrepresented voices again. And this vicious cycle is not new, and already normalization for right rhetoric is not actually a sudden shift. And this is actually continuation of much older tactics that is rooted in colonialism, racial hierarchies, and structural racism that has not really defined yet in many levels, like EU level or national levels. And this factor is also very intertwined with other factors like religion, sexual orientations, and gender in many intersected ways. And this, for us, also appreciate to see this policy brief also offer the analysis that trade unions or civil societies are play a crucial role to expanding the access to the justice, political participation, or awareness, more knowledge to the public. But at the same time, civic space is significantly shrinking. Like anti-racist actors for a few years now harassed or delegitimized or censored. And due to that reason, also can be suffered with the funding situation. And these phenomena aren't technical, but they're actually very political. And they reflect, actually, this is reflection of the failure that we have failed to center the life experience of those most impacted by racialized or impacted by intersectional discrimination. And for us, we of course are excited to see how this strategy, the civil society strategy that Michaela mentioned, and we hope that this strategy also develop into where empowering the NGOs and trade unions are not just allow for procedural access, but also make them to provide the structural support and protection to keep them sustainable, not for just once, or allow for just consultation. And what we also wanted to highlight is we need to do more than just react attacks on far rights. I think that's what we wanted to also mention, maybe for making a counter narrative. So we have to making more to challenging these dominant narrative can be possibly done when we highlight this more shared social inclusive identities, meaning that always we are suffer from othering. That's word more important for our people, but rather than divide them against each other, always creating the inclusive identity can be a potential to disrupt the boundary making process and then making more common causes to develop into the democracy. And one that stopped this treating that racism as a niche issue, I can see that this racism always has been the sideline. And that's why we also has been always sidelined to the structural racism, but we have to recognize this racial injustice as a more condition for democracy itself, because Europe is already migrant society, which has been denied for a long time, but we need to center in those more experienced, those has been excluded or has been invisible, and had to be redistributing the power so that having more access and has to be more participation, like the platform that Michaela mentions, and to centering those experiences to the to community and treat it as a co-governor, not just treating as a service providers. So that's what we wanted to also add it to the very amazing policy brief that made by Carmine and Anoushka. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Injun, and thank you for reminding the necessity to empower CSOs and trade unions, notably. Without losing any further time, I'm handing over to Julie Pasquette. She's the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at INAR. She's specialized in EU advocacy, anti-discrimination policy, and strategic communication. The word is yours, Julie.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. Thank you all. Thank you for the Migration and Policy Group to invite us, and for this, the new European initiative for this very interesting brief. Because as in now, we are a network of 140 organizations across Europe. Participation is central in many of our activities. We put a lot of resources to build capacity and to ensure that our members have access to EU policy-making spaces but also national policy-making spaces. And we also advocate for the conditions to be put in place, as you mentioned in your different recommendations. This is really in line with what we have also been advocating for. Participation is also a central issue that we have mentioned in our brief on the anti-racism strategy, and also in our anti-racism map that is online on our website and monitoring the National Action Plan Against Racism. Because we know that what we are discussing today is not participation gap, but power gap, and the fact that sharing power has always been at the center of racism and racialization, and denial of this redistribution of power, or like the fact of not be willing to share this power, is actually a way to uphold white people's privileges. So this is clear in your brief that this is the political exclusion of racialized people and migrants is structural. It's embedded in historically rooted systems that were never neutral to begin with, and it's really important to highlight, because your findings should not surprise us. Actually, they should force us to confront a deeper question. So was integration or inclusion ever designed to redistribute power to racialized communities, or were they only designed to manage their presence without sharing decision-making authority? And this is also important to think about this question in order to also have the right solutions and to try to push them forward. Maybe this system has never, what's central in this system was never about sharing power, and this is really important to highlight. And for us, we have always highlighted that there is a democratic design problem historically rooted in system. And all what you mentioned in your brief, citizenship law that filter who belongs, political parties that diversify lists but not leadership, civil society consultation without resources or power. These are not just barriers or neutral mechanism, and this is also what we have repeatedly identified as this democratic legitimacy problem, a rule of law problem, a crisis that is entirely predictable considering Europe's continued failure to seriously confront its historical legacies and present systems of racialized oppression. And there is also a reason why far-right ideas are resurging and mainstream increasingly in Europe today, when actually at the same time racialized people are more vocal than ever and taking more leadership role, especially in civil society organizations. We have seen that in our network, where the increase of organization led by racialized people and migrants have been quite clear. So there is really something, also a question to ask here on how the system is trying to keep privileges and to prevent racialized people to share more power. And we have actually, as actually it's also mentioned in your brief, indirectly under media evidence on the European Parliament diversity, you also highlighted some of the articles that are quoting our report on diversity in the European Parliament, which actually is a good example of how structural the problem is. And maybe like what I would like also to highlight is around the new anti-racism strategy, because of course, you know that INA has been quite active in its advocacy around the EU anti-racism action plan and the strategy. And we think indeed this should be much stronger on political participation. Even though it highlights indeed the impact of historical and structural racism, which is in really crucial to keep from the legacy of the first EU Arab. But we have also failed to see any concrete structural reform. For example, there are a lot of issues that are mentioned in your brief that the strategy doesn't tackle. And despite the fact that 56% of consultation respondents around the anti-racism strategy identify migration as a key priority, this has translated into very little concrete measures in the strategy. And we also question how the strategy can do more on protecting and ensuring that migrants have more can participate more, because this is not just about voting rights or being represented in institution. We also see that there are a lot of additional barriers that are increasingly present, especially when it comes to criminalization and securitization of racialized people, including migrants and their organization. And this is where actually we think that there is really an important question around protection of civil society organization and of racialized people and migrants. And where also the civil society strategy, which is a good step forward, is also where it's also lacking is any protection mechanism to ensure that actually like also racialized people and migrants can feel safe and can feel safe to participate as well, when actually there is increasing fear to actually in front of criminalization and securitization. There are good examples around, for example, the increased criminalization of solidarity of organizations supporting migrants, also increased scrutiny for organizations working on Islamophobia. And this has been also a clear example following a recent ECR report that was asking the EC in one of its recommendations to increase scrutiny for any project tackling Islamophobia. So and this is where I wanted to also highlight that there is indeed what you mentioned as a recommendation when it comes to protection and resourcing civil society is really under threat at the moment. In our network as well, it's really something we need to look at, because what's the point of having a nice funding program if racialized led organizations cannot be funded because they are increasingly criminalized or increasingly securitized or delegitimized. So I think there is also a question here of protection and ensuring that all the diversity of racialized people organizations are included. So I think just to end here, it's not just about adopting measures, but it's also about transformation. Are European democracies really willing to transform themselves? Because we, as I've said at the beginning, and as mentioned in one of the questions, it's not just like the system initially has been also designed to to prevent racialized people to participate and to have power. So this is really about redesigning these structures in order to ensure that this power is shared. And with the residuals of the far right and the impact on EU policies, as I mentioned, we must invest more in building civil society power and support as well bold politicians and decision makers to not be afraid of sharing more power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you for reminding us and putting it in your intervention that power and sharing of power has always been at the center of the anti-racism history. And now our last speaker, Adel Al-Baghdadi. He's the founder of We Organization in the Netherlands. He's also the vice president of Vocify. He's a social impact trainer, and he has worked at both local, national, and EU level to strengthen civic and political participation and to address structural discrimination. Adel, the word is yours.
Thank you so much. And I think like after hearing all the intervention from all the speakers, also like from the MPG teams, is really like just showing the importance of the topic of the webinar today. So I think thank you MPG for organizing this. And I think I would really like to start with something that I have heard it in one of our programs at We Organization, because I do believe like when we personalize the topics, it got more impact as whatever theme are we covering. So like I really had like in one of the training, a young participant that shared with me that he said like, okay, I follow politics every day, but I don't think politics will or is following me as well. So this is, I think, really like a word that just hit me in really and stayed with me as well, because it's really captured much of what this report also demonstrates. So I think this is also the personalizing of the report as well, because yeah, the political participation policy index shows that, okay, an EU average of 43 out of 100, particularly, I think it's quite low score of voting rights. And encouragement to vote points to structural gaps. So the issue is not basically the lack of interest, but the lack of access, visibility, and institutional inclusion. With the work that we do with the We Organization, but also as Vocify, we engage with young people and who live with the lived migration experience throughout storytelling, civic education, and youth-led initiatives. Many of them are politically aware. They discuss housing policy, labor market discrimination, climate regulation with depth and clarity. They attend debates and organize community dialogues. But when it comes to really political and when it comes to really formal political participations, unfortunately, the barriers appear. Some are long-term residents without national voting rights. Others are eligible to vote locally, yet never received a proactive or accessible information about how to register or why their participation matters. So encouragement is often assumed rather than really structured in including these voices. Also, the brief also highlight the limited position of migrant-led civil society. This is something we experience, unfortunately, directly, like as a migrant-led organizations throughout We Organization, but also with Vocify. Migrant-led organizations are frequently invited into the conversation, but really rarely embedded into the decision-making structure. So like funding is often really like a short-term, like project-based. We do the project, we submit a report, and that's it. Consultation mechanisms are not always transparent, unfortunately. The input is shared, but the follow-up is most of the time is also unclear. So like you feel that, okay, you've been invited, you share inputs and stuff, but okay, and then what's happening then? Most of the time, unfortunately, it stays unclear. So if I think we really want to address the structural discrimination in political participation, there are three concrete steps that are essential. I think like, first of all, like really member states should reassess the strong link between nationality and the political right. Because like long-term residence and contribution should carry together political recognition. democracy should reflect those who are part of the society in practice, and not only the one with the nationality right. So like if people live there. The second point that I would like to highlight is the encouragement mechanism must be proactive. And automatic voter registration where possible, multilingual and accessible information campaign that will help basically to reduce the gap of the participation. So equal participation does not happen by default. It requires design to make it happen. So this is, I think, the key. The third and the last point that I would like to highlight, the migrant-led organizations should be recognized as structural democratic actors. This means sustainable funding models, formalized constitutional mechanism, and clear accountability process that really demonstrate how input influence the policy outcome. So if participation remains symbolic, trust will also remain fragile, unfortunately. But when participation is institutionalized and meaningful, it strengthens the democratic resilience for everyone, and not only for a specific group within the society. The young person I mentioned earlier did not lack the motivation. What they lacked was the institutional recognition. So this brief give us evidence next to the personal experiences that like we all facing on our daily life. So the next step is political will. And by this, I would like to thank you all for the invitation. And I'm really looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Adele. Thank you also for mentioning the need of reassessment from the national level of the link between nationality and access to political right. But what I will take away from you is something you said that stayed with you as well, coming from one of participants saying, I follow politics every day, but I do not think politics follow me. That really will stay with us, I think. So we have already a couple of questions. Those who want to raise a question orally, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I have two questions maybe for Carmine and Anoushka that you can deal with, and I have questions for Michaela and questions to all of the panelists. So maybe we start with the policy brief. So the policy brief discusses racial discrimination within existing institutional frameworks. How does it address the redistribution of power itself, rather than improving access to systems that were historically built on racial hierarchies? And the second one for you, Carmine, the policy brief highlights data gaps. What are the suggestions on how to collect data in ways that empower communities rather than reinforce surveillance or oppressive technocratic control?
Yeah, very, very good question. I would like really to emphasize actually our policy recommendation from our research on structural racism, that one of those is like really to collect equality data. So one of our main, let's say, policy recommendation is for governments to collect comprehensive data on, could be on self-reported, for instance, ethnicity or racial identity. That could be also anonymized. So this will not, we have to debunk the fact that there is this risk that the data could be instrumentalized or could be violating privacy or other sensitive concern, because that quality data are essential, and something that we've discussed also with the Commission in many occasions, to actually understand the problem, to understand the factors, which grounds people are discriminated, and in which dimensions. And so I think that's one of the main recommendation that we should put forward. And so I don't know if I really understood the other question, the political
The policy brief discusses racial discrimination within existing institutional frameworks. How does it address the redistribution of power itself rather than improving access to systems that were historically built on the racial hierarchy? I do not think that it was really the aim of the policy brief, but I leave it to the authors.
Yes, I mean, it was clear also that the sexual racism really is reflected in the way the institutions and the political powers as well are built nowadays. I mean, we have just provided some data on how many racialized groups are represented in the Parliament, European Parliament, that is here in Brussels. It's really doesn't really reflect the diversity of a society. That we mentioned that it's more than 10% of European population that has a racial ethnic background, and much less is represented in our institutions. So there is still this dichotomy between white and non-white individuals that are that is still present in our political power and distribution that is not equal. And this is something that also relate to the historical colonial past of the member states, and actually still reflecting in our society. So, and indeed, also one of our recommendations that also we have would like to put forward is the fact that also the government should recognize also its past, his historical mistakes, also to heal with the present society, also to start a process that is more inclusive of racialized group, and that can be reflected also in the institutional and political power distribution.
Thank you, Carmine. I mean, for the participants, Carmine was referring to the 24 policy brief on structural racism, which is larger than this one, focusing also on political participation. And you will receive an email with all the links to these different policy briefs and publication. I see that Shada has raised her hand, Shada Islam. So Yoris, if you can give her access to be able to speak. Or maybe.
I have it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much.
We don't see you.
You need to see me too.
No, as you want.
No, I don't mind, but I don't see. I'm on my iPad and I don't see that icon.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I just it's just a thing. First of all, thank you. I mean, it's all been very informative, and I have to say, also convinces me that there's a long road ahead. I had 3 points, and I'd like your sort of comments on it, whoever wants to come in. First of all, I think we all heard what Marco Rubio said at the Munich Security Conference the other day, the very racist speech that he made. And my fear is that, as per usual, our European leaders are going to follow, if they're not doing that already, along those lines. So I think we have a double challenge ahead, really. It always was difficult. It's going to become even more difficult now. So I'd like a comment from anyone who wants to do that. In fact, I was quite horrified that there was hardly any response from any of the EU leaders, and that just shows how absolutely uninterested they are in issues of racial justice. My second point is I was listening to this amazing Riz Ahmed, the British actor, who's just brought out a South Asian version of Hamlet. And what he said has stuck with me. And I think it has been said before, but it's worth repeating. He said, we have to stop knocking on the doors and asking for a seat at the table. We have to build our own buildings and build our own tables. And I think this is something that has been missing from our rather cautious and modest, but very, very, of course, very important work that all of us have been doing as organizations, but as individuals, in my case, is that we have been very cautious, we have been very restrained, we have been very diplomatic. We've come out with amazing ideas and our lived experiences, but the response has been, as we know, basically brushing it off. And for all that Michaela has tried, the new anti-racism strategy is, frankly, a disappointment. And that's not to lay the blame at her feet, obviously. So I think we need to get a little bit more of and I know we're all doing it as much as we can, but we are restrained by our own European diplomacy standards. This Brussels consensus sits very heavy on our shoulders, and perhaps it's time to think about how how we can find the leadership, a more vocal, more eloquent, more determined leadership that frankly we've lost now that the Brits have left the European Parliament. We had it in many cases. So I'm anxious to hear your comments on some of these thoughts that I've had for the last 2 or 3 days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shada. So I will give the floor back to the panel, adding another question, the 3-4. Someone asked, what specific policy actions do you see as most effective and necessary for fighting against structural discrimination beyond individual complaints? So I think some of them are already included into the policy brief, but I'll add that to the points that Shada just mentioned for the panel to react. And then there are 2 questions from Michaela specifically. Could you please give a definition of diversity-sensitive guidelines evoked in the CSO's participation strategy? How is diversity measured, and what was it the same across countries in the one which had guidelines? And the second one, how does the coordinator work to try to ensure that EC high-level staff and commissioner do not fuel racism by the way they are talking about migration and asylum? My God, you're asking a lot to Michaela. How can she do that? For instance, currently Home Affairs Commissioner, DG Home Directors and official EC documents regularly talking about illegal migration and migrant and fuel a toxic narrative on migration. So Michaela, that's more for you. But for all of you, one after the other, reaction to what Shada mentioned, and then any other specific policy action that you would see as most effective and necessary. So who wants to take the floor first?
I can start. Yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting question. So I'm trying to answer like 2 different of them. But I think for me, it's really like comes back to what I was saying. I think there are urgencies at the moment where, because racialized people and migrants are being highly attacked, not only in discourses, but also in the streets and by institutions themselves. And it's increasingly the case. So we are in a moment. I mean, I've been at INA for 15 years. I've never seen this level of political attacks, but also increasing violence. We have been advocating for the anti-racism strategy to include something, a structural reform or structural solutions on police violence, for example. So how can we expect migrant or racialized people to politically participate if they feel unsafe, including by those that are supposed to protect them? How can we also expect them to participate when their civil society organizations that are led by them are being criminalized, delegitimized, defamed, when they are the only one that they really trust? I mean, look at the underreporting level for equality bodies, for example. Like, we need to really count on civil society to ensure participation. However, we see really a different trend at the moment. So like on the issue of equality data collection, it's not for us, it has been something on which we have advocating. We know we need it, but to be honest, this is no longer a priority at the moment. People will not trust governments that are led by far right to collect equality data collection. So I think, just as to be very short, we need solidarity, we need boldness, and we need to empower racialized people and migrants. And this is around power sharing. And I think that we really need to encourage politicians, decision makers, to be bolder. And we need to tell them that we will stand by them, and this is how they will succeed, because that's really around that. And also among civil society, we need to build stronger solidarity. And I agree with Shada. We need to stop trying to be only like politically correct. This is no longer the time to try to soothe people or to try to just ensure we still have a seat at the table. If it means that we silence ourselves, it means we cannot, confront injustices that are increasing. So I think solidarity and boldness, I think, are the 2 words that I will end there.
Thank you. Adele, Yunjun? Michaela?
Sure. Yes. thank you for the good questions, and indeed the question on how can the coordinator ensure that high-level staff such as commissioner do not fuel racism is a tough one. Listen, I can't control what people say, right? What I see as my role as the coordinator is to, first of all, I mean, I think this is also related to what Julie said, or what we're discussing about representation. In institutions like the Commission, it's not typical to see racialized people, first of all, in many or any roles. So a very big part of my work is broadening representation of who can be a civil servant, one, but also on trying to include a mainstreaming of anti-racism aspects across the EU, different EU policy areas. The time now is very different than when I joined in 2021. I think there was a bit more openness and opportunities, even within the institution, and the times are different now. I think I'm very happy that we have an anti-racism strategy, and I think the opportunity is now in the implementation of the anti-racism strategy, and this is also where we need to build on partnerships with different levels, including and specifically with civil society organizations. And here we're trying to also strengthen civic space through broadening the permanent anti-racism civil society platform. For people in political leadership roles, they need to recognize their position and power and their responsibility in their speeches. But of course, I cannot, as a Commission coordinator, unfortunately, control what is said, even if I disagree myself. I think that's understandable. There was another question for me, which I already omitted. I think it was related to structural racism. I just want to quickly add to that. I think one of the main issues, including data, I think it still should be a priority. I do understand Julie's perspective that when there is when there's fear and no lack of trust in authorities, I understand that there's no will to provide such data, necessarily sensitive data. However, I do think it's important for us to understand the full state of play of equality. In addition, we need to have a full understanding of, or a common understanding on what we mean by structural racism. I think this is still missing, and this is something that we will work on with member states, but also consulting civil society on arriving at a common understanding on the EU level on a common working definition on structural racism in the next years.
Thank you, Michaela. Yunjun, anything to add?
For me, already many people mentioned the very important things, but I wanted to echo what Julie said about the solidarity, and also about the Adele said about proactive measures, because we cannot just react right now about this disastrous situation. I think that we also have to making a bigger bubble for ourselves to counter effect to this variety metrics, and also to even for building a data collection, for example. It cannot be done for ourselves, for example, but we can do better with the other network together. And I think that we should make a more organic partnership with not only for civil societies, but also inter-community stakeholders like think tanks, and then also the congressmen and also the communities, and how can we also making more transparent communication, not making miscommunication and then fail to fight against more evil part. That's what I want to say. Solidarity and proactive measures. Yeah.
Thank you. Adele?
Yes, thank you so much. I think for me, what really stuck with me is the saying that like an English actor, I think she highlighted that was saying about like building our own building. I have, I think, quite a different like opinion about that because I do believe in the power of collaborating and like really, I still believe that if we collaborate and cooperate with each other, we are able to make the change. But if every one of us will build their own buildings, yeah, like what kind of world, of what kind of society are we heading to? I understand the vision from it, yet I think we can still make the change, expand the room, doing it in a different way, I think. But I think if the EU really serious about the anti-racism action plan and democracy resilience agenda, there are like really three directions that are essential to implement this aspect as well. I think like reassessing the link between nationality and the voting right. So with this, I think we still can collaborate, yet we can make the change. Institutionalizing the proactive voters engagement mechanism. So like with this, and also like embedding the migrant-led organization within the consultation and funding frameworks. So political participation should not be depending on proximity to power. It should be really granted through institutional design. So I do believe that like if we really manage to integrate that within the institutional, within the design itself, there we could really make the change. So I think the strength basically of the European democracy will not be measured by how will it protect power, but by how will it really share it. And this is, I think, how it should be really the point. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Adele. So we're coming to an end. If you allow me one more minute, I mean, Julie had to leave at 2:15 very sharp, but we thank her. I mean, to the participants now, this policy brief and the recommendations, they belong to you. So please use it, campaign around it, around the recommendation. I mean, as we heard again and again today, structural and institutional racism continues to undermine democratic participation of racialized minorities and migrants across the EU. And it does so by limiting their access to decision-making spaces, weakening trust in institutions, and constraining equal political participation. As always, it's a question of power, and a lot has been said about power, and Adele, definitely it's about sharing the power. So it's not about overtaking the power from one side or the other. I would like to insist on a definition of legal definition of structural and institutional racism. I would also like to insist on sanctions, and let's take the formulation of the 2 Anti-Discrimination Directive. The sanctions should be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. And finally, we heard a lot about having a seat at the table. One of my colleagues used to say, if you are on the menu, you don't sit at the table. And that's what happens. This creates democratic deficits. And this is why meaningful, and I do really insist on meaningful consultation of relevant civil society organization, migrant-led organization, and CSOs representing racial minorities is necessary, but not only consultation, but also participation in the decision-making process, because it has become a bit fashioned to consult, to make the right consultation, but when comes the time to make the decision, then these organizations are not there anymore. And as we have seen that the representation is quite low, then the decisions are made without dues that it affects the most. We all have quite some work ahead of us, especially in the current political climate that is clearly endangering our democratic values. So good luck to everyone. Thank you very much for your participation. Thanks a lot to the panelists for your participants. The links to the policy brief, this one, but also the political participation index and the previous structural racism brief and recommendation will be sent to you by email, and they're all available on the MPG webpage, and the recording will be available on the MPG webpage later today as well. I wish you a fruitful journey and have a very nice day, and thanks a lot for joining us. Bye.